The phone call that ruined my brother's $1 million deal came on a Tuesday morning. And the strange part? At the time, I had no idea I was about to destroy it. I was just standing in my kitchen, half awake, pouring coffee into a mug that still had yesterday's stain on the rim. My phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. Normally I ignore those. Spam calls, insurance offers. But something about the moment felt off. The house was quiet. Too quiet. So I picked up. Hello? A cheerful woman answered. Hi. Is this Daniel Carter? Yes. Hi Daniel, my name is Michelle. I'm calling from Harbor Title Services to confirm tomorrow's closing. I frowned. Closing? Yes, sir. The closing for the property on Willow Creek Road. For a second, my brain stopped working. Willow Creek Road. That wasn't just an address. That was my parents' house. The house where my brother Ethan still lived. The house we grew up in. The house nobody had mentioned selling. Ever. I think there's been a mistake, I said. Michelle sounded confused. I'm sorry? I'm not selling a property. Well, she said, typing on her keyboard. You're listed as a related party connected to the sale. Connected how? The seller listed you as his brother. My stomach tightened. My brother? Yes, Ethan Carter. That's when the morning stopped feeling normal. Because Ethan hadn't said a word to me about selling the house. Not once. Not during the last 6 months. Not even when we spoke briefly on Christmas. So I asked the obvious question. Is my brother selling the house? Yes, sir. And the land? A pause. Yes. That's when something clicked in my mind. Something small, something quiet, but extremely important. Because Ethan could sell the house. Technically. But the land under the house? That was a completely different story. And suddenly, my father's will came rushing back into my memory. 2 years earlier. A lawyer's office. A thick stack of paperwork. And one sentence that had seemed strange at the time. Ethan gets the house. Daniel gets the land. Back then, I thought it was unnecessarily complicated. It felt like the most important detail in the world. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Michelle, I said calmly. Yes? You might want to double-check something. What would that be? The land title. I could hear typing on the other end of the call. Then silence. Longer than before. That's strange. What is? The land parcel is registered under Daniel Carter. I took a sip of coffee. Cold now. That would be me. 10 seconds of silence followed. Then Michelle said something very carefully. I think we have a situation. You probably do. Because your brother signed a contract stating he owns the entire property. I almost laughed. That sounded exactly like Ethan. Big promises. Big deals. Big risks. And sometimes, very big mistakes. How much is the property selling for? I asked. She checked her screen. $1.2 million. I whistled quietly. That's ambitious. Yes, sir. And the buyer's already paid the deposit. How much? 200,000. That made me smile. Because somewhere across town, my brother Ethan was probably celebrating the biggest deal of his life. Completely unaware of one tiny problem. For the sale to go through, he needed the land. And the land belonged to me. I stared out the kitchen window at the quiet street. A dog walker passed by. A delivery truck rolled slowly down the road. Everything looked normal. But somewhere else. A $1 million deal had just become a very complicated problem. Michelle? I said. Yes? You should probably tell the buyers something. What? That the ground under the house? I paused. Doesn't belong to the seller. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Then she said quietly, I'm going to call our legal department. That's a good idea. And your brother will probably contact you soon. I smiled. I'm counting on it. The call ended. And just like that, the most expensive mistake of my brother's life had officially begun. Because Ethan had always been good at one thing, selling the dream. But our father used to say something at dinner that sounded like a joke back then. Ethan sells the dream. Daniel reads the contract. At the time, everyone laughed. But 2 years later, that joke was about to cost my brother over $1 million. And the strangest part? I still hadn't even left my kitchen. I didn't call Ethan after that phone call. Not right away. For about 5 minutes, I considered it. I even picked up my phone once. But then I put it back down. Because calling Ethan would only do one thing. Warn him. And my brother had always been very good at one particular skill. changing the story before anyone else heard the truth. So instead of calling him, I got in my car. The drive to Willow Creek Road took about 40 minutes. 40 quiet minutes to think about something that suddenly felt very strange. Ethan hadn't mentioned selling the house. Not once. Not casually. Not accidentally. Which meant one thing. He hadn't forgotten to tell me. He had chosen not to. That realization sat in the back of my mind the entire drive. When I finally turned into our old neighborhood, everything looked the same as it always had. Wide streets, large trees, quiet houses, the kind of suburban neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seems to happen, which made the giant real estate sign in the front yard look almost ridiculous. For sale. And beneath it, a bright red banner. Under contract. I slowed the car and pulled over across the street. For a moment, I just sat there, looking at the house. Childhood homes always look smaller when you come back to them. The white paint had faded. The porch railing leaned slightly. But the maple tree in the front yard was still there. The one Dad planted the year I was born. Except now there was something new in the driveway. Two unfamiliar cars. A black Range Rover. And a silver Mercedes sedan. People were standing in the yard. 3 of them. Walking around slowly. Pointing. Measuring. Taking photos. Developers. You can always tell. Developers never look at houses. They look at land. Lot size. Zoning. Square footage. Potential profit. And right in the middle of them was Ethan. He was wearing a navy blazer and sunglasses. Talking loudly. Gesturing toward the backyard like he owned the entire world. You could easily split the parcel into 3 luxury lots, he was saying. Parcel. Interesting word choice. Because Ethan didn't actually own the parcel. He owned the house, which was sitting on land that technically belonged to someone else. I stepped out of the car and walked up the driveway. Ethan saw me immediately. For a brief second, his confident smile disappeared. Then he recovered. Daniel, he said. The way he said my name sounded more like a question than a greeting. What are you doing here? I glanced at the developers. Nice to see you too. Ethan walked down the porch steps toward me, lowering his voice. You should have called before showing up. That's funny, I said. I was about to say the same thing. His jaw tightened. What does that mean? I heard you're selling the house. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Oh, that. Yes. He waved casually toward the property. Great offer came in. You should be happy for me. Happy. That was an interesting word. Because technically, the house belonged to him. But the land beneath it did not. One of the developers stepped forward and extended his hand. Hi there, he said politely. Mark Sullivan. Daniel Carter. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh, Ethan mentioned you. I glanced at my brother. Did he? Mark nodded. He said you moved to the city and weren't interested in the property. I tilted my head. Is that what he said? Before Mark could answer, Ethan stepped between us. So, anyway, Ethan said quickly, like I was explaining earlier, the redevelopment potential here is incredible. The woman standing beside Mark held a tablet filled with architectural sketches. We're planning 3 homes, she explained. About 3,500 square feet each. 3 houses. Which meant they needed the land. Not just the house. And that's when I asked the question. The one question Ethan clearly hoped nobody would ask. Did Ethan explain the ownership structure to you? The air changed immediately. The woman frowned. I'm sorry? The ownership structure, I repeated. The land and the house are technically separate assets. Ethan's voice cut in sharply. Daniel. But I continued anyway. Which part exactly did you purchase? Mark looked confused. We purchased the property. I pulled out my phone. Opened the county property records. 2 taps. Then I turned the screen toward them. This is the land parcel. Mark leaned closer. The woman stepped beside him. They both read the screen silently. Then they looked up. At Ethan. Why does this say Daniel Carter owns the land? The silence that followed was immediate. Heavy. Uncomfortable. For the first time since I arrived, my brother didn't have an answer ready. Finally he laughed. A little too loudly. Guys, relax, he said. It's just a technicality. I raised an eyebrow. A technicality? He put a hand on Mark's shoulder. The house is mine. The land is basically part of the same property. The woman crossed her arms. Is it legally the same property? Ethan didn't answer. Because the answer was obvious. It wasn't. Mark looked back at me. Daniel, is that accurate? Yes. You own the land? Yes. He turned slowly toward Ethan. So what exactly did we sign a contract for? That question landed like thunder. Ethan tried to recover. It's still the same deal, he said quickly. We just need to move some paperwork around. I shook my head. That's not how property law works. The woman spoke next. Wait. So the house sits on land you don't own? Ethan said nothing. Mark exhaled slowly. Then asked the question that ended the conversation. Ethan, can you legally sell the land? Silence. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Finally, Ethan muttered, Not technically. The woman lowered her tablet. Then, we have a problem. Mark looked at me again. Daniel, were you aware this property was being sold? No. Did you agree to it? No. Have you signed anything? No. Mark nodded slowly. Then he turned back toward Ethan. That's a very serious issue. Ethan's confidence was gone now. Completely. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and panic. Daniel. Can we talk inside? I smiled slightly. Sure. We walked into the house together. The living room looked exactly the same as it had when we were kids. Same fireplace. Same shelves. Same dent in the wall from when Ethan tried to throw a baseball indoors at age 12. Except now the room was filled with moving boxes. Ethan closed the door behind us. Then turned around. What are you doing? Standing in the living room. You know what I mean. Yes. I do. He ran both hands through his hair. You're sabotaging the deal. No, I said calmly. You did that yourself. You could have warned me. You could have called. You live 40 minutes away. That doesn't mean I stopped owning land. He paced the room. This deal is already happening. Deposits are paid. Contracts are signed. Lawyers are involved. Then you should read the contract again. He stopped pacing. What do you mean? I mean you can't sell something you don't own. He stared at me. You could just sign the land over. I laughed. You're serious? It would fix everything. For you. For everyone. That's when I realized something important. Ethan hadn't made a mistake. He had taken a gamble. A calculated one. He assumed one of two things would happen. Either I would never find out, or I would cooperate, once the deal was already underway. Classic Ethan. Create the situation first. Solve the problem later. Preferably with someone else's help. He stepped closer. How much do you want? I shrugged. I haven't thought about it. Well, think fast, he snapped. Because if this deal collapses... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Outside, I could hear the developers talking quietly, probably discussing the situation, probably realizing something was very wrong. Ethan looked at the window nervously. Don't say anything else to them. That depends. On what? On whether you tell them the truth. Before he could answer, there was a knock on the door. Mark's voice came through the hallway. Ethan, we need to talk. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Because deep down, he already knew. The $1 million deal he thought he had just closed was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. The knock on the door came again. Louder this time. Ethan? Mark's voice echoed through the hallway. We really need to talk. Ethan stared at the door like it had suddenly become a problem he couldn't solve. Then, he exhaled slowly and opened it. Mark stepped inside. Claire followed. Neither of them looked particularly friendly anymore. The curiosity from earlier was gone. Now they looked cautious. Professional. Concerned. Mark folded his arms. All right, he said calmly. Let's clarify something. Claire held up her tablet. Is Daniel correct? Ethan forced a smile. There's just a small technical issue. Mark raised an eyebrow. Technical issue? Yes. The house and the land are technically registered separately. Claire turned toward me. And you own the land? Yes. She slowly looked back at Ethan. You didn't mention that. Ethan spread his hands like this was all being exaggerated. It's a family matter. Mark shook his head. No. It's a legal matter. That sentence changed the tone of the entire room. Mark stepped closer to the dining table and pulled a folder from his bag. Inside were several printed documents. The purchase agreement. He flipped to the signature page. You signed this 3 days ago, he said. Ethan nodded. Yes. Mark tapped a paragraph with his finger. This document states that you are the sole legal owner of the property at 1847 Willow Creek Road. He looked up. Is that accurate? Ethan didn't answer. The silence stretched. Finally, he said, Well, Technically, the house is mine. Claire crossed her arms. That's not what the contract says. Before Ethan could respond, the front door opened again. A tall man in a gray suit walked in carrying a leather briefcase. Sorry I'm late, he said. Traffic was a nightmare. Mark gestured toward him. Perfect timing. The man set his briefcase on the table. I'm Andrew Patel, he said. Counsel for Summit Development. The developer's lawyer. He shook hands with everyone in the room. Then he opened the folder Mark had brought. For a moment he scanned the contract silently. Then he looked up. Okay. Let me understand the situation. Mark pointed toward me. Daniel owns the land. Andrew blinked. Oh. That single word carried a lot of weight. He turned toward Ethan. You didn't disclose that during negotiations. Ethan shifted slightly. It's still the same property. Andrew shook his head. No, it's not. He flipped through the pages again. This agreement guarantees that the seller owns the entire property. He tapped the clause with his pen. Which includes the land parcel. Claire spoke quietly. But he doesn't own the land. Andrew nodded. Correct. Mark leaned back against the counter. So what does that mean legally? Andrew answered without hesitation. It means the contract cannot be fulfilled. The room went quiet. Ethan stared at him. That's ridiculous. No, Andrew said calmly. It's contract law. Ethan laughed nervously. We can fix this. How? Daniel just signs the land transfer. Everyone in the room looked at me. I shook my head. No. The word landed hard. Andrew nodded slowly. Then we have a problem. Ethan's voice sharpened. What kind of problem? Andrew closed the contract folder. A financial one. Mark glanced at him. Explain. Andrew turned another page in the file. The buyers transferred a deposit when the agreement was signed. He looked at Ethan. Correct? Ethan nodded. Yes. Andrew looked back at Mark. How much was the deposit? Mark answered. $200,000. Claire inhaled quietly. That number suddenly felt much heavier than it had earlier. Andrew continued. That deposit was transferred directly to the seller. Which meant one thing. Everyone slowly looked at Ethan. Andrew asked the obvious question. Where is the deposit now? Ethan froze. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Claire asked softly. Don't tell me you already spent it. Ethan's silence said everything. Mark stepped forward. Ethan, how much of the deposit is still available? Ethan rubbed his forehead. About 80,000. Claire stared at him. You spent $120,000 in 3 days? Ethan looked defensive. I had expenses. Andrew leaned back slightly. That money was conditional. Ethan snapped. It was part of the deal. No. Andrew corrected calmly. It was part of the agreement. And the agreement required accurate ownership representation. Mark Seahill. So let me get this straight. He pointed toward Ethan. You sold property you don't fully own. Then he pointed toward me. And the person who owns the land didn't agree to the sale. Yes, Andrew said. That's correct. Mark nodded slowly. And the deposit is already spent. Ethan said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Claire looked at Andrew. What happens if the deal collapses? Andrew answered very carefully. The buyer can demand the deposit back. Ethan's head snapped up. They won't do that. Andrew continued. If the deposit cannot be returned. He paused. The buyer can pursue legal recovery. Mark finished the sentence. Which means we sue. The word hung in the air. Ethan laughed again. But this time the laugh sounded strained. That's insane. No, Andrew said. It's standard. Claire closed her tablet slowly. So what are our options? Andrew turned toward me. There are two. First, he said, the deal collapses. Mark added, and we pursue legal action to recover the deposit. Ethan's face went pale. Andrew continued. The second option, he looked directly at me, is negotiation. Mark nodded. If Daniel sells us the land. Claire finished the thought. The project can continue. Ethan stared at them. Wait. This is my deal. I shook my head. Not anymore. Andrew opened a blank page in his notebook. Daniel, he said, would you consider selling the land? I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. Yes. Ethan blinked. What? Mark leaned forward. What price? I looked out the window toward the backyard. The maple tree swaying slightly in the wind. The place where Ethan and I once built a terrible treehouse that collapsed after 2 weeks. Then I turned back to the table. Market value. Andrew nodded. And what do you believe the land is worth? I smiled slightly. About $900,000. Ethan's chair scraped violently across the floor as he stood up. 900,000? Andrew didn't react. Mark didn't react either. In fact, they both looked thoughtful. Claire checked something quickly on her tablet. Then she nodded. That's actually close to our estimate. Ethan looked at them in disbelief. You can't be serious. Mark shrugged. The land is the project. Andrew nodded. Without it, the house has very little redevelopment value. Claire said the number out loud. Maybe 80,000. Ethan stared at them. You offered 1.2 million last week. Mark nodded. Yes. For the entire property. He pointed toward me. The land is 90% of the value. And that's when Ethan finally realized something. The deal he thought belonged to him now belonged to someone else. The room stayed quiet after I said the number. $900,000. No one laughed. No one said it was ridiculous. Which was exactly why Ethan looked so shocked. Because he expected the developers to reject it immediately. Instead, they were thinking about it. Claire was already tapping numbers into her tablet. Mark leaned against the table, staring out the window like he was doing mental math. Andrew, the lawyer, simply nodded. Which meant one thing. The number made sense. Ethan looked back and forth between all of them. Are you serious? Mark shrugged. That's roughly what we estimated the land would cost. Ethan pointed at him. You offered 1.2 million for the entire property. Yes. And now you're offering him 900,000? Mark corrected him calmly. We're offering him the value of the land. Claire added, the house itself isn't the asset. The land is. Ethan laughed bitterly. So I'm just. Andrew spoke gently. Not entirely. He slid a document across the table. You still own the structure. Ethan stared at the paper. The house. Yes. And what is that worth? Claire answered without hesitation. Probably around 80,000. Ethan stared at her like she had just insulted him. 80,000? Yes. That's generous. Mark explained. The house will be demolished. So we're basically buying the structure to clear the lot. Ethan ran both hands through his hair. You're kidding. No, Mark said calmly. That's redevelopment. The numbers were suddenly very simple. The developers needed the land, not the house. And the land belonged to me. Ethan slowly turned toward me. You planned this. No. Yes, you did. You walked into it yourself. You could have warned me. You could have called. That ended the argument immediately. Because we both knew it was true. If Ethan had made a single phone call before signing the contract, none of this would be happening. Andrew closed the contract folder. Let's take a 5-minute break. Everyone stepped outside onto the back patio. Everyone except Ethan. He stayed inside, standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the floor. I walked toward the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water. That's when Ethan spoke again. Quiet this time. You're really going to take the deal? Yes. And leave me with $80,000. You signed the contract. He shook his head slowly. You don't understand. Understand what? I already spent the deposit. That got my attention. How much? You heard them. 200,000. And how much is left? About 80. Which meant exactly what it sounded like. Ethan had already spent $120,000. In 3 days. I leaned against the counter. What did you spend it on? He hesitated. Then muttered. A car. Of course. Ethan always celebrated before the victory was secure. How much? 90,000. And the rest? Business stuff. Credit cards. I nodded slowly. So if the deal collapses, I owe them 200,000, he said. Yes. And I don't have it. I took a sip of water. Then you probably shouldn't have spent it. Ethan's voice hardened. You're my brother. And you tried to sell my land. I thought you wouldn't care. That was a bad assumption. He leaned closer. You could fix this. How? Sell me the land. For how much? He hesitated. Then said the number. 50,000. I laughed. Actually laughed. You're serious? It would save the deal. For you. For both of us. No, I said calmly. For you. Ethan slammed his hand lightly against the counter. If the developers walk away, I'm ruined. That's not my responsibility. They'll sue me. Probably. And you're okay with that? I'm okay with protecting what belongs to me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan asked something quietly. What do they want? The land. And they'll pay you 900,000. Yes. And I get 80,000 for the house. Yes. He laughed again. The sound was hollow. That's the worst deal I've ever made. You made worse. Fair point. We walked back outside. The developers were standing near the backyard fence discussing something. Andrew waved us over. All right, he said. Let's talk numbers. Mark nodded. We want the land. Claire turned her tablet so everyone could see the valuation report. 3 houses, each around 3,500 square feet. Projected sale price, 1.4 million each. Andrew added, the project still works financially. Mark looked at me. So the question is simple. What price do you want for the land? Ethan jumped in immediately. He doesn't know the market. Andrew raised a hand. I think Daniel does. Mark looked at me again. 900,000? Yes. Claire nodded. That fits the project budget. Mark extended his hand toward me. Then we have a deal. Ethan's head snapped toward them. You can't just cut me out of this. Mark answered calmly. We're not cutting you out. You're selling us the house. For 80,000. Andrew added. And avoiding a lawsuit. That sentence shut Ethan up instantly. Because the alternative suddenly sounded much worse. Claire opened a new contract document on her tablet. We'll restructure the closing. Andrew nodded. 2 transactions. He looked at me. Land purchase from Daniel Carter. Then he looked at Ethan. Structure purchase from Ethan Carter. Ethan stared at the ground. Because the deal he thought he controlled had just been rewritten in front of him. Without his permission. Mark extended his hand toward me again. Congratulations. I shook it. And just like that, the $1 million deal Ethan thought belonged to him, belonged to someone else. But the most interesting part of the day hadn't happened yet. Because later that night, Ethan revealed something that made his situation even worse. Much worse. Ethan called me that evening. Not a text. Not a message. An actual phone call. Which immediately told me something. Things had gotten worse. Because Ethan almost never called unless something was urgent. Or desperate. I let the phone ring for a few seconds before answering. Hello? His voice sounded different. Lower. Less confident. Daniel, can we talk? We already talked today. I know. But this is important. I leaned back in my chair. So was selling my land. Silence. Then he said 2 words. Dinner tonight. What? Let's meet somewhere. To talk. I almost said no. But something about the way he sounded made me curious. Where? I asked. The Oak Ridge Grill. That made me pause. Because Oak Ridge Grill wasn't just a random restaurant. It was the same place where we held the small memorial dinner after Dad's funeral. Same private room. Same long wooden table. Same quiet corner where our entire family sat 2 years earlier. Ethan knew that, which meant he was trying to use the memory. Trying to control the mood. Classic Ethan. 7 o'clock, he said. Then he hung up. Oak Ridge Grill hadn't changed. Dim lighting. Dark wooden walls. The quiet sound of people talking at nearby tables. The hostess greeted me when I walked in. Mr. Carter? Yes. Your brother is already here. Of course he was. Ethan liked arriving early when he needed to control a conversation. The hostess led me down the hallway to the private room. The same room from 2 years earlier. Except this time, there were only 2 chairs at the table. Ethan stood when I walked in. He was wearing a dark suit. But the confident energy from earlier that day was gone. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept much. Thanks for coming, he said. I sat down. What do you want, Ethan? The waiter poured water and left the room. For a moment, Ethan didn't speak. He just stared down at the table. Finally, he said the words I had been expecting. I need your help. There it was. Simple. Honest. Late. With what? I asked. You know with what. The deal. Yes. I nodded slowly. So explain something to me. What? Why didn't you call me before signing the contract? Ethan sighed. We talked about this. I want the real answer. He leaned back in his chair. Because I thought you'd complicate things. How? You'd want part of the money. That's called ownership. You weren't involved in the house. But I own the land. Ethan rubbed his forehead. I know that now. Yes. You keep reminding me. Because it keeps being true. The waiter returned to take our order. Neither of us cared about the food. But we ordered anyway. Steak for him. Chicken for me. The door closed again. Ethan leaned forward. I made a mistake. That was rare. Ethan almost never admitted mistakes. You think? I said. I should have talked to you first. Yes. But the deal is already happening. No, I said. It isn't. He shook his head. It could be. How? All you have to do is sell me the land. I almost laughed. You're still trying that? Because it solves everything. For you. For both of us. I shook my head. No. No. Ethan stared at me. You're willing to walk away from $1 million deal. No. I'm willing to take my part of it. That's not what you're doing. That's exactly what I'm doing. He leaned closer. You know I can't pay them back. The developers? Yes. The deposit. That's not my responsibility. They'll sue me. Probably. Ethan lowered his voice. Daniel. He hesitated. Then finally said it. I could lose everything. For a moment I didn't respond. Then I asked the obvious question. What exactly do you want from me? Sell me the land. For how much? He hesitated. Then said the number. 50,000. I stared at him. Then I laughed. Actually laughed. You're asking me to sell $900,000 of land for 50? You're my brother. And you tried to sell my land. I thought you wouldn't care. That was a bad assumption. Ethan's voice started rising. If you take the deal with the developers, I get nothing. That's not true. You get 80,000 for the house. That's barely anything. That's the value without land. He slammed his hand lightly on the table. You're punishing me. No. I'm protecting my property. You're my brother. And you signed a contract selling land you don't own. The room fell quiet. The waiter returned with our food, plates sizzling, but neither of us touched them. Because the conversation had already passed the point where dinner mattered. Ethan pushed his plate away. What happens if I refuse the restructure? I shrugged. Then the developers cancel the deal. And they ask for their deposit back. His jaw tightened. You know I don't have it. I know. And then? They sue you. The word landed heavily between us. The most expensive word in business. Ethan stared at the table for a long time. Then he said something quietly. You know what the worst part is? What? I actually believed this deal would fix everything. What everything? My debt. My business. My life. He looked up at me. And now you're taking it. I shook my head. No. You gave it away. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then Ethan leaned back in his chair. You know what's funny? What? Dad probably saw this coming. That sentence caught me off guard. What do you mean? The will. The house to me. The land to you. He laughed quietly. He knew exactly how this would end. I thought about what Dad's lawyer had said 2 years earlier. Ethan is good at spending money. Daniel is good at protecting things. Maybe Dad had seen it clearly all along. Ethan looked at me again. So this is it? Yes. You sell the land? Yes. And I'm left with $80,000. Yes. He nodded slowly, then said something almost peaceful. Well, I guess that's the price of assuming. Dinner ended quietly after that. No shouting. No dramatic scenes. Just two brothers sitting across from each other in a restaurant full of memories. When we stood up to leave, Ethan said one last thing. You win. I shook my head. This isn't about winning. It feels like it. It's about ownership. He looked at me for a long moment, then gave a tired smile. Dad always said you read the contracts. Yes. And I guess I should have started doing that. Probably. We walked out of the restaurant together. But once we reached the parking lot, we went in different directions. Different cars. Different futures. Because the closing date for the deal was only 3 days away. And after that day, nothing about the property on Willow Creek Road would ever be the same again. 3 days later, we were all sitting in the same room again. But this time it wasn't the living room of our childhood home. It was a conference room at Harbor Title Services. A long glass table filled the center of the room. Stacks of documents sat neatly in front of each chair. Folders. Pens. Closing statements. The kind of room where life-changing numbers move quietly from one person to another. I arrived 5 minutes early. The receptionist guided me upstairs and pointed me toward the conference room. When I walked in, Andrew was already there. The developer's attorney. He stood and shook my hand. Morning, Daniel. Morning. He gestured toward the chair beside him. We've prepared the revised agreements. I nodded and took a seat. Claire sat at the far end of the table with her laptop open. Mark stood near the window finishing a phone call. Everyone looked calm, professional, prepared, which made the empty chair across from me stand out. Ethan's chair. Andrew followed my glance. He'll be here, he said. Eventually. 2 minutes later, the door opened. Ethan walked in. And he looked very different than he had 3 days earlier. No blazer. No sunglasses. Just a wrinkled dress shirt and tired eyes. He nodded quietly to everyone and sat down without saying a word. Andrew cleared his throat. All right. Let's begin. He opened a large folder and slid a document toward me. As everyone knows, the original purchase agreement required modification after the discovery of separate land ownership. Ethan stared down at the table. Andrew continued. We now have 2 separate transactions. He tapped the document in front of me. The first is the purchase of the land parcel from Daniel Carter. Claire turned her laptop so everyone could see the number on the screen. Joshua Mayuan. The room stayed quiet. Everyone had already heard the number before. But seeing it printed on an official document made it real. Andrew looked at me. Please review page 3. I skimmed the document. Standard language. Transfer of land ownership. Escrow terms. Payment conditions. Everything looked exactly as it should. Andrew nodded. Looks correct? Yes. Then you can sign when ready. But he didn't hand me the pen yet. Instead, he turned another page. The second transaction involves the sale of the residential structure. He slid another document toward Ethan. Claire spoke the number out loud. $80,000. Ethan didn't touch the paper. He just stared at it. Because the math was impossible to ignore. 3 days earlier, he believed he was closing a $1.2 million deal. Now he was selling a house without land. For $80,000. The difference sat in the middle of the table like a physical object. Heavy. Embarrassing. Real. Mark leaned forward. Before we continue, he said calmly, I want to thank Daniel for cooperating with the restructuring. He nodded toward me. Without the land agreement, the project wouldn't exist. Andrew added, this solution allows the development to proceed. Claire nodded. And keeps everyone out of court. Ethan laughed quietly. Everyone? Andrew didn't respond. Because even he knew that wasn't entirely true. Claire tapped another number on her laptop. There is one additional item. Ethan finally looked up. What item? Andrew spoke carefully. The original contract included a misrepresentation clause. Ethan's expression hardened immediately. Andrew continued. Because the seller represented himself as the sole owner of the property. He paused briefly. Legal review became necessary when the ownership discrepancy was discovered. Mark added, our legal team spent the last 3 days restructuring the entire transaction. Claire finished the sentence. That process generated legal fees. Andrew said the number. $30,200. Ethan blinked. 30,000? Yes. And who pays that? Andrew looked directly at him. The party responsible for the original representation. Silence filled the room. Because everyone understood what that meant. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. You're charging me $30,000. Andrew corrected him gently. We are recovering legal expenses caused by the contract error. Ethan laughed bitterly. That's a nice way to say it. Andrew placed a pen on the table. Let's proceed. He turned to me. Daniel, please sign the land transfer. I read through the document one more time. Not because I doubted it, but because reading contracts carefully had always been my habit. Our father used to insist on it. Always read the last page twice, he would say, because that's where the important numbers usually hide. Everything looked clean, professional, final. So I signed. The sound of the pen against paper echoed quietly through the room. Andrew collected the document. Claire typed something quickly on her laptop. Then she smiled slightly. Escrow release initiated. Mark stood up and shook my hand. Congratulations. Just like that. $900,000 moved from one account to another. No shouting. No drama. Just a signature. Ethan watched the entire thing without speaking. Andrew then slid the second contract across the table. The structure sale. Ethan stared at the page again. $80,000. Yes. And $30,000 in legal fees. Yes. He did the math out loud. So I walk away with 50. Andrew didn't correct him. Because Ethan had calculated correctly. From what he believed would be $1 million deal, he was leaving with about $50,000. Less than 5% of what he expected. Ethan picked up the pen, held it above the paper. For a moment, I wondered if he would refuse. If he would walk out. If he would try to stop everything somehow. But Ethan had always been good at recognizing when the game was over. And the game had ended the moment he signed the first contract. He lowered the pen, signed the document, and pushed it across the table. Andrew nodded. Thank you. Claire typed again. Second escrow release confirmed. Mark stood. Well, he said, that concludes the closing. Just like that, the deal was finished. Chairs moved. Folders closed. The room slowly emptied. Within 2 minutes, only Ethan and I were left inside. He remained seated, staring at the table, at the place where the $1 million deal had quietly disappeared. Finally, he spoke. You know what the worst part is? What? I actually thought I was the smartest person in the room. I smiled slightly. That's a dangerous thought. He nodded. Yeah. Then he stood up slowly, picked up his coat, and looked around the conference room one last time. You didn't ruin my deal, he said quietly. I did. That might have been the most honest thing Ethan had said in years. Outside the office building, the afternoon sun was bright. Cars passed on the street. People walked by without any idea that a $1 million story had just ended inside that building. Ethan stood beside his car. You got what Dad wanted you to protect, he said. The land. Yes. And I got what I deserved. I didn't respond. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need commentary. He opened his car door, then paused. Next time I sign a contract. He gave a tired smile. I'll read it. I nodded. Good idea. He got into his car and drove away. And just like that, the biggest deal of my brother's life was over. But the story of that land on Willow Creek Road wasn't finished yet, because 2 weeks later, something happened that made the whole situation even more ironic. 2 weeks after the closing, the house was gone. Completely gone. I drove past Willow Creek Road on a quiet Saturday afternoon and almost didn't recognize the place. The white house we grew up in had already been demolished. The porch, the old living room, the hallway where Ethan and I used to race each other when we were kids, all of it had disappeared. In its place was a wide open construction site. Bulldozers, stacks of lumber, survey markers stuck into the dirt. The developers moved fast, faster than I expected. But one thing was still there. The maple tree. The same tree Dad planted the year I was born. It stood near the corner of the lot, untouched by the demolition crews. Apparently the developers decided to keep it. Something about the landscaping plan. I parked my car across the street and watched the construction workers for a few minutes. It felt strange. Watching the place where your childhood once existed turn into something completely different. Not sad exactly. Just strange. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the sidewalk. That's when I noticed someone standing across the street. Ethan. He was leaning against the hood of his car, watching the construction site the same way I had been. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he walked over. They work fast, he said. Yes. He looked at the bulldozer, pushing dirt across the lot. 3 houses, right? That's the plan. He nodded slowly. You know what the crazy part is? What? I told everyone this land would make someone rich. I smiled slightly. You weren't wrong. Just not the way I expected. That made him laugh. A real laugh this time. Not the nervous one from earlier. Not the bitter one from the closing. Just tired honesty. He kicked a small rock on the sidewalk. You come here to check on your investment? He asked. First time. I've been here twice. That surprised me. Why? He shrugged. I guess I wanted to see what I almost sold. The bulldozer engine roared as workers began measuring the foundation lines. Ethan watched them quietly. You know what's funny? He said. What? I used to think Dad didn't trust me. That caught my attention. What do you mean? The will. The house to me. The land to you. He shrugged. I thought it was his way of controlling things from beyond the grave. I looked back at the construction site, then at the maple tree. Maybe it was. Ethan shook his head. No. I don't think so anymore. What changed your mind? He looked at the land for a long moment before answering. Because Dad knew me. I didn't say anything. Ethan continued. He knew I'd eventually try something big. Something risky. Something that sounded brilliant at the time. He smiled faintly. And he knew you'd read the contract. That sentence sounded so familiar. Because Dad used to say it all the time at dinner. Ethan sells the dream. Daniel reads the contract. Ethan leaned against the fence and watched the workers for a moment. You know what the worst part of all this was? He said. What? I actually believed that deal would fix everything. What everything? My debt. My business. My life. He looked down at the ground. And instead it exposed everything. Sometimes failure does that. It shows you problems that success would have hidden. Ethan looked back at me. But honestly, what? Losing that deal might have saved me. That surprised me. How? If I had walked away with $1 million? He shrugged. I probably would have burned through it in 2 years. That was probably true. Instead, he walked away with $50,000. And a very expensive lesson. He nodded toward the construction site. You know those houses will sell for millions. Yes. And you'll probably make even more if that land value keeps rising. Maybe? He laughed quietly. Dad would have liked that. Probably. We stood there in silence for a few minutes, watching workers mark the foundation lines. The future of the property was already being built. Literally. Finally, Ethan checked his watch. I should go. Where to? Meeting with a financial advisor. That made me raise an eyebrow. Really? Yeah. He shrugged. Turns out losing $1 million deal is a great way to start reading contracts. I laughed quietly. Dad would appreciate that. Yeah. He opened his car door, then stopped. You know something else? What? For the first time in my life, I'm actually going to read every contract. That's a good habit. Better late than never. He got into his car, started the engine, then rolled down the window one last time. Hey, Daniel. Yeah? You didn't ruin my deal. I know. I did. He nodded once, then drove away. I stayed there for another minute, looking at the empty lot. The land looked bigger now, full of possibility, but also full of memories. And standing there, I realized something. This story had never really been about revenge. Not entirely. It was about something much simpler. Responsibility. Our father knew both of his sons very well. He knew one of us would dream, and the other would protect. So he divided the property in the only way that made sense. The house. For the dreamer. The land. For the one who reads the contract. And in the end, the land was exactly where it was supposed to be. 3 months later, the first foundation was already finished. I drove past Willow Creek Road again, on a quiet Sunday morning. Construction crews were everywhere. Concrete trucks. Electricians. Stacks of framing lumber. The empty lot where our childhood home once stood had completely transformed. What used to be one aging house was now 3 massive construction sites, 3 future homes, each one larger than the house we grew up in, each one expected to sell for well over $1 million. Developers move fast when money is involved. I parked across the street again, the same place I had parked weeks earlier. And once again, the maple tree was still standing. The workers had built protective fencing around it to keep construction equipment from damaging the roots. Apparently, it had become part of the landscaping plan for all 3 houses. Funny how the one thing Dad planted decades ago was the only thing that survived the demolition. I stood there for a moment, watching the workers measure the first frame of what would eventually become the largest house on the lot. Then my phone buzzed. A text message. From Ethan. It was the first time he had contacted me since the closing. The message was short. Just one sentence. Met with my financial advisor today. Then another message came through. You were right. I smiled slightly. A few seconds later, a third message appeared. I should have read the contract. That made me laugh, because it sounded exactly like something Dad would have said. For years, our father had repeated the same joke at family dinners. Ethan sells the dream. Daniel reads the contract. At the time, everyone thought it was just a funny observation about our personalities. But looking back now, I think Dad understood something much deeper. He knew Ethan would always chase big ideas, big risks, big opportunities, and sometimes those people built incredible things. But he also knew someone had to protect the foundation. Someone had to read the fine print. Someone had to notice the details that everyone else ignored. That's why he split the property the way he did. The house, for the dreamer. The land, for the one who protects it. And in the end, that one decision changed everything. Because when Ethan tried to sell $1 million dream, he forgot one very important detail. The ground under that dream was never his to sell. I looked at the construction site one last time. 3 houses would soon stand here. Families would move in. Kids would play in the yard, where Ethan and I once built a terrible treehouse that collapsed after 2 weeks. Life moves on like that. Quietly. Without asking permission. Before I got back into my car, another message from Ethan appeared. This time it was longer. I signed a consulting contract today. I read the whole thing. I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back one sentence. Good. A few seconds later his reply appeared. Dad would be proud. I looked at the construction site again, at the maple tree, at the land that had once held our childhood home. And for the first time since this whole situation began, I felt something close to peace. Because in the end, no one really won, and no one really lost. One brother learned how to dream, the other learned how to protect. And thanks to our father, both lessons came at exactly the right time. This story is fictional and created for entertainment.
This content is entirely fictional. Any similarity to real persons or events is coincidental. This video is not news, not a documentary. It is presented for creative storytelling purpose only. AI assisted production.